Does cover crop steal water? I mean, I think the question is yes. Steal water in terms of water being a limited resource, right? And that's an important key there. And if you have unlimited water, or you don't, that's not a huge issue, and that's not your limiting factor, then it's not an issue, right? But in these regions, and a lot of other regions in the kind of southern U.S., maybe the arid West, where water is in fact limiting. I know these are conversations that we're going to start having, right? As water resources decline everywhere.
This episode of Voices from the Field continues the conversation between NCAT Sustainable Agriculture Specialist Colin Mitchell and Dr. Alexis Racelis of the University of Texas Rio Grande Valley about the use of cover crops in semi-arid subtropical environments. In particular, the conversation centers on the Subtropical Soil Health Initiative, a research partnership between NCAT and UTRGV, to address soil health changes in the Lower Rio Grande Valley. This week, Colin and Dr. Racelis get into the research results of the Subtropical Soil Health Initiative project so far, and discuss upcoming research in the Rio Grande Valley. The link to the first half of the discussion is in the notes below. Let's listen.
In this episode, I'm speaking with Dr. Alex Racelis about cover cropping and semi-arid subtropical regions. So will you dive into what we found in the research from the Subtropical Soil Health Initiative? Did cover crops steal water? Did some cover crops steal more water than others? What did we find?
Okay, so I'm going to just start back in year one of our project, right? I don't know if you were there yet, but in year one of our project, which was in 2017, fall of 2017, we worked with a farmer on a 40-acre piece of property that he normally grows sorghum on. And, we decided to choose a handful of species that we thought would be appropriate at the time of planting. So, we got a late start that year. We actually only started in November of that year, in part because that's when we actually got the funding came through. So that first year, with the farmers' participation, we selected a few cover crops that included legumes like field pea and hairy vetch, and then some grasses, right, including triticale. These were ones that we thought would come up in kind of late fall and then contribute to things like nitrogen, which is the kind of the second limiting factor of the success of a grass commodity crop. Which requires a lot of nitrogen, right? So we planted this, in that block with the farmer who used, some of their equipment and really implemented this at scale. And we were able to, you actually work with the farmer to set up a very much a scientific layout. We call it a randomized block design, where we actually had, different areas in the farm repeat with 5 different treatments, including one area where we did nothing. Well, when I say we did nothing, we did not plant with a cover crop. And so in that season, we terminated it also a little late. We terminated, I think, in the beginning of February. And as we were terminating the cover crops, the farmer who was operating the tractor, who went through the entire field and, just kind of incorporated these cover crops into the soil, terminating them using a disc, and a mower, actually mowed first and then disc, actually told us and said, hey, look, I can tell you which of these blocks was the driest. Of the 5 different treatments I did, this one was the driest, this was the second driest, third driest, and this one was the one that had the most moisture. And we asked him, well, how do you know this? He said, well, it's just the way that the tractor rides. I can tell you how the implement bounces. And then, of course, we corroborated that information with the moisture sensors that we put into the ground. And sure enough, the farmer was 100% accurate on like up to the rankings of it, right? So it was at like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, spot on, just the way that the tractor operated. In that experiment in particular, the one that had the highest moisture is the one where we did not plant any cover crops at all. And why is that? Well, I mean, the cover crops actually did really well that year. They produced a lot of biomass, especially some treatments that included field pea and a combination of field pea and a grass, the triticale, and it produced a lot of biomass. But like I said, Colin, when you have plant biomass, that means both carbon dioxide and water, right? And so of course we knocked the cover crop down, and then at the time of planting, we did take that sample of soil moisture, and we realized that the driest was in fact where we did not have cover crop. How do we corroborate this, with this kind of participatory action approach? Well, a few days afterwards, we kind of went in and we went back into the field and we measured, well, how many of the seeds actually germinated in those fields. And we did find that the highest germination rate was, of course, in the fields that had most moisture, which were the fields where we did not plant cover crop. Now, in that season, I will note that we did have sorghum failure throughout the entire field, mostly because we did not have any moisture at all across the entire season. But there were some lessons that we learned that first year, which included, planting date. We didn't plant early enough for reasons beyond our control. Because that like I mentioned earlier, that sorghum has to get into that ground at an optimal time here in the Rio Grande Valley, which is around February, right? To take advantage of the increased chance of rain that, if you look at climate patterns here in the Rio Grande Valley, there's a higher chance in February than there is in the other months. So of course, we didn't have that rain. The recharge period, the time that from the time we terminated the cover crops to the time we actually planted the cash crop was very short. It was only 2 weeks. And in that short time, there was very little rainfall. And so we didn't see any of those perceived benefits of cover cropping in that year. Now, in the second year, we had a opposite story. We had actually a successful cover crop. We planted a lot earlier. We actually was able to accommodate a long recharge period, which is, as I mentioned to you, we terminated the cover crops around the end of November, beginning of December, and we planted the sorghum again in the beginning of February, which is more than a 2-month period, during which we did have some rainfall. And then, of course, the sorghum was successful. But it wasn't just successful in the cover crop areas, it was successful across the entire field, including the areas where we did not have any cover crops planted. So in that sense, yes, although we had a successful cover crop and it did add to some of the other soil health metrics, we didn't find it actually provide any improved benefit in terms of an improved yield. And in fact, the yield of sorghum from cover cropped areas was the same as the yield that we got from non-cover cropped areas, right? So that doesn't include all the other metrics we use when we measure soil health, but I can tell you that the one that the farmer's most interested in is improved yield, which, as I mentioned to you earlier, has at least a lot to do with water in these dry farm systems. So I guess the message here is that, and we did it again for the third year. And in fact, we just finished up the fourth year a couple of months ago. We're starting to look at the data again. But the lessons here is that, does cover crop steal water? I mean, I think the question is yes. Steal water in terms of water being a limited resource, right? And that's an important key there. And if you have unlimited water, or you don't, that's not a huge issue, and that's not your limiting factor, then it's not an issue, right? But in these regions and a lot of other regions in the kind of southern US, maybe the arid West, where, water is in fact limiting, I know, these are conversations that we're going to start having, right? As water resources decline everywhere. I mean, you see it declining in California. You see increased competition of water between farms and cities. That's a conversation that we're going to have everywhere. And so, stealing water is a conversation that's on the tip of everyone's tongue. It's just because water has become increasingly rare. And here in the Rio Grande Valley, like other parts of the US and in the world, when water is not reliable, when rainfall is not reliable, then yes, I mean, that is a resource that we have to really measure closely. And so I can tell you right now, Colin, that our 4-year studies say that it's a very important consideration, and it's a very important concern, because in years where water is extremely limited, let's say, for example, when you get a below average year in terms of the expected amount of rainfall, then cover crops can be a detriment to yield. But when you have years like we had this year, where we had an abundance of water, probably a little bit too much, then maybe cover crops, with all the other benefits that it does provide, in terms of adding organic matter to the soil, in terms of improved bulk density, in terms of improved carbon in the soil, improved nitrogen in the soil, all those other benefits, they all may come into, we may reap those benefits this year. But I think the message here is that in areas like subtropical South Texas, like these arid subtropics in the rest of the world, that cover crops can be kind of a double-edged sword. It can provide some of those benefits, but really may come at a cost to a farmer where water is limited.
Yeah, I think it really speaks to the risk that these farmers in these, more semi-arid, arid regions are taken on by adopting cover crops. And sure, they may see those, co-benefits, eventually, but it may be a lot slower, because they may have years where they plant something, and not only do they not get those soil health improvements through growing a cover crop, they also have reduced yields, which affects their bottom line and financial viability.
That's correct. Yeah. And, and in the end, Colin, I think some farmers, of course, they use that kind of benchmark in terms of yield per acre as the benchmark of a successful crop. But I think some farmers are willing to exchange the kind of income, like benefits, for costs, right? So if, for example, if a farmer says, hey, look, if you can save me on herbicide use, and it's not more than what I would pay for cover crops, he's like, yeah, I would do it. If cover crops could be associated with decreased weed pressure, yeah, sure, why not? In fact, and that's one of the metrics we see is that in this area, where you do plant cover crops, you're able to suppress weeds much easier, much longer through the season than if you don't have cover crops at all. And so we do find that, but some of those benefits take longer to accrue than others, right? And so I'm not saying that a foregone income isn't unusual with dryland farmers, but when it's something that they can prevent by maybe not planting cover crops at all, I think that's something that should enter the calculus about how we promote it.
Yeah, I think double-edged sword is a perfect way to describe it. So, if we're talking to our semi-arid, subtropical dryland farmers out there, even just semi-arid, dryland farmers, and they want to use cover crop recommendations, what recommendations can we make about timing of plantings, which will, of course, depend on what their, cash crop is going to be, species to use, and when to terminate cover crops, and maybe even a little bit into how. I know we have some pretty poor results with our old roller crimper there. So I think that conversation about termination in areas where it doesn't freeze very much is much more interesting, or if you're not spraying. But even then, with the roller crimper, we've seen some challenges when sprays were applied,
So when we talk about roller crimpers, and you've probably seen the pictures, we've tried roller crimpers here in the Rio Grande Valley. I think they work best when you can kind of roll over your cover crops. I've seen them. I've seen the roller crimper when I went to do a fellowship with a USDA lab there in Lincoln, Nebraska. And I've seen them in action, that they'll roll over and lay down a cover crop, and then you get the benefit of a cold season, right, where it actually further terminates those cover crops. You're trying to terminate a cover crop here in South Texas. You'll roll it over and in 2 weeks, half of it standing back up. And we've done some experiments on timing of termination, but in the end, it doesn't do that kind of job, especially when you don't have other tools in your toolbox, right? So a lot of the cover crop growers across the country, they'll roller crimp and then they'll come back with a herbicide application to finish the job. We actually work with some certified organic grain growers that they don't have those tools. So then they'll have to come back and maybe use a mower, a flail mower, or maybe use a disc to really kind of make sure. And there are some cover crops that terminate easier than others. So we actually we were really excited about the use of Sunhem Crotillaria juncea as a cover crop. I mean, it had a lot of potential, right, in terms of producing biomass. It really did a good job of eliminating other weeds in the field. It was actually associated with improvements to soil biodiversity, including beneficial nematodes. But it's just so difficult to terminate here in the Rio Grande Valley. I know there's some researchers out there who've studied how to terminate these in the Caribbean, and we spoke to some of them, and we actually tried to adopt some of their techniques, but we haven't found a successful technique of terminating Sunhem. And so it's kind of fallen out of the favor of some of our collaborators, because they're like, unless I really want to spend extra money spraying it, then it's not worth it. It's not worth the benefits. We found a slew of cover crop candidates that are appropriate at certain times, that are optimal and during some specific times. We're actually putting together that kind of calendar for South Texas. So if there's any growers in South Texas that really want to see that, feel free to email me or call me, and Colin can kind of give you that information. But we're trying to finalize that. So there would be some that we would recommend during certain times of the year. And there would be some other cover crop candidates that we would recommend based on the kind of conditions of the farmer, right? So, we have worked with vegetable growers that do kind of high value crops that have access to water, and those would be different recommendations than I would make to like a dryland farmer who wants to plant right after a corn or sesame harvest, right? Right around July. I would ask folks to just not necessarily guess, unless you kind of want kind of a experimental at heart, because some of these cover crop recommendations that might come from other parts of the country are not cheap, right? We found that, like, for example, when you can, we've tried, 8 species mix and a 12 species mix and even a 4 species mix. And in the end, you get 1 or 2 or 3 of those that just kind of outcompete everything else. And so it's almost worth just sticking and putting your investment in those 3 candidate cover crops at that, if you're interested at that time. So for example, in the warm season here in the Rio Grande Valley, which is really kind of the months of June, July, and August, we find that the most successful combination is of sun hemp, cowpea, or sorghum Sudan. It's a hybrid of sorghum and Sudan grass or Sudan grass. And so those cover crop species are most appropriate. Again, I mentioned, sun hemp is a little bit more difficult to terminate, without going over more than once. And so, we're trying larger trials right now with just cowpea and Sudan grass. We do have one grower who's really interested in trying tillage radish, but and we're willing to experiment using that participatory action process. We definitely want that shared learning together. So we're going to try a planting of tillage radish probably in the next few weeks at that farm, maybe beginning of September, which is just entering that window of when it's optimal to plant here in the Rio Grande Valley. And so I think it's very important to pay attention, because in the end, like, just taking what you might learn off the internet and then investing all that money into that, planting them at the scale that I know a lot of the commodity crop growers plant at, it can be discouraging when you say, hey, I just spent, $120 an acre on cover crop seed for a 12 species mix, and only 3 of them came up, and so I could have probably saved some money. So I think those are all considerations. Of course, it makes it even more difficult when you're doing it in an area where nobody has, the right equipment. Nobody, when we started our project with Subtropical Soil Health Initiative, I think we were the first operation to have a cover crop drill, like this one where it can actually plant more than one size seeds at a time. Probably the first, we worked with one of the farmers who was the first person to own a roller crimper. And so, of course, a lot of it's like, well, how the heck do we use it? Nobody knows, and we can't find the parts to replace it. So all of that is part of the challenge. But I would recommend that if anybody has any curiosity about what might be optimal, that they are welcome to contact me. right? Because I think that it all depends. We try to avoid just kind of making blanket recommendations. We want to be able to understand where you're trying to grow, what are your conditions, and what are your limiting factors. If your limiting factor isn't water, then there's a whole nother slew of recommendations that we might provide. If your limiting factor is nutrients, like for example, you're getting poor yield because of nitrogen as a limiting factor, we might suggest a whole different slew of legumes, for example. Those are something that I kind of would like to put myself out there as somebody who works for a public serving university. That's part of my job. I don't want to make any recommendations now, specific recommendations, because I don't want somebody to say, oh man, you know what, I listened to this guy on your podcast, Colin, and he said to do this, and I just, spent all this money and he was wrong. I probably am wrong, because like I said, once we have that conversation, then we can learn together, right? And as I've had more than one farmer tell me, hey, look, I am more than willing to let you guys make any mistakes than me make those mistakes, because it's my livelihood. Whereas, for us, it's our job to help inform. And that because that, as you mentioned, that's the mission of our program. That is the real goal, is to use our scholarship and our kind of shared learning to really inform farmer by farmer, right? What's the best, information that they can have to make a decision for their own farm.
Definitely. And, you pass the technical assistance test. It depends. That's always the answer I give. I'm like, well, we need to have like an hour long conversation before I give you some recommendations on, something related to your operation. And even then, call me and let's, talk about it,
Yeah, you know what? And you probably figured it out. That's my long way of saying, hey, look, I don't want to say, what's best, because, in the end, like I said, it is really based on what are the limiting factors for your farm, right? And if your limiting factor is just that you just got a huge invasion of a specific type of weed that you just can't seem to get rid of because it's herbicide resistant, then it's going to be different. It's going to be a different recommendation than a dryland farmer whose limiting factor is moisture, right? Or for example, if you are a vegetable grower who wants to do cover cropping, and you want to make sure that you can use a cover crop as a rotation, that's a completely set of different recommendations. I think we're comfortable enough after 4 years of trial and error with the Subtropical Soil Health Initiative to be able to give South Texas farmers recommendations based on our experiments, not just with dryland farmers, but we also did some research with irrigated vegetable farmers. And I do know of some folks who are trying it with fruits and vegetables, who are trying to do cover cropping with watermelons, or cover cropping, with winter vegetables, for example. I feel more comfortable just putting myself out there and to be able to kind of answer specific questions than to just provide some generalities that may or may not be helpful. In fact, may be hurtful, because, we're talking about people's livelihoods. We're talking about money and investment. I mean, you wouldn't want to come to me with questions about how to invest your money. I can tell you that. And so I wouldn't put myself out there for folks unless I knew what were the specific questions that they were asking.
Well, we'll be sure to skip over all the Bitcoin questions I had planned for the follow-up.
I'm a university professor, so when it comes to money, I'm the last person you want to talk to.
I will put Dr. Racelis' email in the description of this podcast. So if you have questions about some cover crops, especially for the South Texas, you can reach out to him. Or if you are just listening on Apple Podcasts and for some reason the email is not in the description, just give us a call on our answer line, 800-346-9140. Get 800-346-9140. We'll make sure we get you connected with Dr. Racelis on that. So the last question I had for you is kind of related to, our Subtropical Soil Health Initiative wrapping up, but, the work will still continue on with the project through the USDA NRCS Conservation Innovation Trials Grant is going to still be focusing on cover cropping in the Rio Grande Valley. Can you talk about how you plan to grow on the findings from the Subtropical Soil Health Initiative and what you'll be up to during the project?
Yeah, absolutely. NCAT is still a very much a big part of the project. We've been collaborating actually for the last 8 or so years on different initiatives, all related to sustainable ag in this region. As you mentioned, we were recently awarded a grant from the USDA to really implement our understanding of cover crops in this region at a scale, at a large scale. Right. So up until now, I mean, although we were doing research, at that farm scale, we really wanted to demonstrate this using on-farm trials across the entire region. So based on our success from our Subtropical Soil Health Initiative, we actually have launched a larger demonstration trial, including farmers across the entire 4-county region, and who want to implement this at scale, right? So 200 acres, 300 acres or more. Some farmers have signed up for 80 acres, others have, signed up for, but we have 5 farmers across the region who've agreed to also allow us to evaluate the impact of cover crops, not just on soil moisture, but some of and soil health, but also on some of the other metrics that are increasingly important in terms of natural resources conservation, including things like biodiversity conservation, especially of insects and other beneficial insects like bees and butterflies, that kind of stuff. And of course, every time you have a crop on the ground, it has implications of biodiversity conservation, both of below ground biodiversity and above ground insect biodiversity. So we have got this huge trial that include researchers from 2 institutions, that include outreach specialists with NCAT. We have a number of grad students. We have 5 farmers. We're all on the same team trying to implement cover crops across a wide region, and really kind of evaluating the entire package on what and what are and including the social and economic implications of cover crops. At the moment, we suspect that, at least in our region, cover crops will come at a cost to growers, right? I mean, you heard my description. I think the 2 out of the last 4 years, we had sorghum failure that was a little bit more pronounced in areas where cover cropping had occurred because of the implications of taking up moisture. And so there is a risk to some farmers that they bear. And we also have evidence that there is a lot of benefit of cover cropping. Things like the soil health metrics that we commonly use, that are used with, across the country by federal and university researchers to measure the health of soils. I mean, we have seen that those metrics improve over the last 4 years. But again, the costs these are all public benefits we get from cover cropping that come at a private cost, right? I mean, the farmers are the ones who are going to expect to pay for the costs of cover cropping, the labor of it, the cost of seeds, and the potential and risk of foregone income, especially in dry years where, cover crops may exacerbate dry soil conditions. And so the project, what's unique about the project is that it provides an incentive to participants, to our growers, that say, hey, look, we want to learn together. In fact, we appreciate your collaboration to the point where we want to incentivize your participation in this project. And so there are financial incentives to farmers who participate. We're able to work with those growers that when they plant and successfully grow cover crops in their farming system, that we will pay them, because I think the conversation has to be about how can we alleviate some of those private costs for farmers so that we can all reap the public benefits of cover crop and these kind of soil health management systems, right? Who pays for it? I mean, in the end, we all benefit from reduced erosion. We all benefit from improved biodiversity. And we all improve from, increased carbon capture, improved soil health. We all benefit from that. And farmers will benefit, I think. That's the hypothesis, is that I think that over time, some of those accrued benefits will then result in, improved soil moisture capture, improved bulk density, improved soil water capacity, where plants can actually bring up the water easier. And then, of course, all the other slew of benefits that we will get from cover crops that have been proven not just here in the Rio Grande Valley, but it's been corroborated by our work and work across the entire country. But then the conversation really is well, okay, then can we help inform those who are the ones who are actually making these decisions on the ground? And so we can help those by providing, real relevant information for them. And then in the end, I think we can also help by helping with some of the costs, right? Those upfront costs, those private costs. And so that's what this entire project is about, Colin. This Conservation Innovations Trials grant we got from the USDA includes maybe half of the budget on ways to reduce those costs for farmer participants. So this year we're starting with 5 participants, but we have an increasing budget to welcome the participation of other growers in our region. We do provide a financial incentive for those who want to grow cover crops, and so as well as technical assistance, right? And so if there's a grower out there in the Rio Grande Valley or Texas or any others who are kind of limited by access to water or just kind of really want to ask some questions, we want to offer our technical support. But also, if there are any other growers out there in the Rio Grande Valley or even Southern Texas who are interested in implementing this, they should reach out to us and our program so that we can perhaps incentivize them to adopt some of these soil health management strategies, and so that we can start to increase the public benefits we get from these innovative farmers.
That's great. It's exciting stuff. And, we'll be posting stuff on ATRA and still be working with you here at NCAT. So if you're tuned in now, stay tuned and you'll be seeing more of that project as it progresses the next 4 years. So
I'm happy to report back once we have some major findings. Right now, we are scrambling to get stuff in the ground. We recently just purchased a 30-foot grain drill, which was shipped to us here in the Rio Grande Valley. None of the local dealers know what to do with it, and so we're actually trying to buy a kit to help adjust seed rating it's a John Deere 455 grain drill. So if anybody, has a kit that help you adjust seed rates, please contact me. We have our eye out for one. But those are part of the challenges, and then of course what makes it very difficult. But once we kind of overcome some of those challenges here, I'm eager to actually report what we might learn in this next year. We'll have another conversation at that point, Colin, and hopefully, we can shed a little bit more light on opportunities for cover cropping here in the region.
Yeah, definitely. I know. What's the acreage y'all just planted the past month or so? Now it's finally dried out a little bit, and we're supposed to get a bunch more rain. Yeah.
The last week we planted 122 acres of cover crops. This year we're hoping to plant 885 acres total that are included in our evaluation, right? And so for anybody who does agronomy research, 885 acres is a lot. It's a big trial, right? And so we've got this like 5 or 6 different sites across the region. We've got sensors and monitors in each of them. We're taking data from each of them. And these farmers are just champs, right? They're juggling cover cropping with all the other issues that they're juggling, but they're also quite keen on understanding how they can improve the sustainability of their own operation. And so, I feel it's our job as public researchers to provide them that information. And again, going back to what I talked about earlier, this is all kind of within this mind frame of me as I don't have the, I'm not on the pedestal that farmers are in terms of their contribution to the world. My job is just to support them as best I can with the skills I have, right? And I think we the farmers that we're working with, I can say that we're all interested in the same thing, is trying to bequeath, our world in a better way than we left it, right? And so we need everyone's help here, not just researchers and not just researchers and like outreach specialists, anyone else who wants to become involved in this kind of work, scholars, economists, whoever want to help. We could always use all the help we can get. So, if we got any other people tuned in that has some interest in assisting our program, either through a scholarly way or some other way, please also feel free to contact us. In the end, we have multiple goals, not just improving, the sustainability of farms, but also to like kind of generate and train the next generation of scholars who can really kind of tackle these issues, right? And I'm proud to say that at least on our project, as you know, Colin, we have had countless of students through UTRGV and from elsewhere, actually, who've come from elsewhere to study under our project. And they take that kind of systems thinking, and they take their skills, whatever range it is, from, developing skills in drone operations, or developing skills in sensor use, or developing their bilingual skills, or developing their skills to communicate with growers. Those are all those important skills that we need if we want to continue working with farmers, not just here in South Texas, but everywhere, right? We need to start training folks who just don't assume things happen on a 10 meter by 10 meter experimental plot, at the school farm, but who have a greater understanding of kind of some of the rural realities that farmers have, right? And instead of making kind of generalized recommendations, they make very specific ones that are useful. And I think that's where that whole participatory action research really comes in play here, because it's not just what I'm telling farmers to do, it's that what we've learned together, right? And in that process, a student can learn as well. And so I think there's multiple wins here that we can celebrate. Ultimately, we still do need a lot of help. And I welcome farmers, I welcome students, anyone who's interested in participating in our program in any capacity. Please feel free to contact me, because I will not turn you down. I can promise you that.
Yeah, that's great. And just on a closing note, I uplift the farmers we work with down there. Man, they're superstars. They're awesome to work with in the work they do, and be able to dial everything. And I feel like they've made our lives a lot easier.
Yeah, I think what ends up happening is that we all have the same goal, right? And so we're very fortunate to find cooperating farmers that, everything else aside, right? We all want the same thing. We all want kind of an improved sustainability in our operations. We also are very mindful of our own impact and our legacies, right? So we have farmers that are old farmers, right? Above the average age of farmers. And we've got young farmers who are my age, your age, right? Who are farming. And they all have kind of that same vision. Like, hey, look, how do I make sure that I don't do, I leave, my legacy in good shape, so that if my kids wanted to continue farming, that they could do that, right? And so how do I work with farmers? Well, I can say, well, let's work together now on research that we do together, and to answer some of the questions that you have, not the questions that I'm asking. And then secondly, how can we train others to come in behind us, right? And saying, okay, well, I'm not going to assume that I know everything. The farmers know way more than we can pretend to know. It's a kind of a different type of understanding sometimes, but we're all kind of on that same page of wanting to learn together. I think when we can find that situation and promote it, then I think that the shared understanding will have that much more impact. And again, Colin, not just on a farm, but also on that kind of intellectual capital with students, with farmers, where they have that additional investment in that kind of shared understanding. That's what's going to really kind of lead to the types of farming systems that I think we can all be proud of, either as a researcher or a student, or as a farmer, or as an organization that works on appropriate technology. Whatever those wherever you are, I think, like I said, if you have that shared and similar interest and want to help contribute in any way, this is the time. So I will welcome you, and I do hope to be bombarded by emails, of people who are willing to help.
All right, open invitation. There you go, y'all. Well, hey, we're out of time. So Alex, Dr. Racelis, thank you so much for doing this. I know we'll have another one at some point, just going over more results from the project.
Yeah.
So yeah, I really appreciate you. And, we'll hear some from those farmers during that other results one. And if you're listening to this podcast and you're interested in other podcasts for this project, we have one on drone monitoring. We have one on cover crop inoculation and troubleshooting that with Stephanie Casper, who came out of Dr. Racelis' program, all former students under Dr. Racelis. So I encourage you to go find those on our podcast list. And so I do want to wrap up by just, thanking again NRCS. This podcast is produced by the National Center for Appropriate Technology through the ATRA Sustainable Agriculture Program under a cooperative agreement with USDA Rural Development. And this podcast is also made possible, again, in part by our funding from the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service Conservation Innovation Grant Program, which is a great program. And Dr. Racelis' new program is, made possible through the Conservation Innovation Trials Program. So some great opportunities under NRCS. Yeah, thanks again, Dr. Racelis.
Hey, it's my pleasure, Colin. Anytime.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. Additional information about this episode and related resources can be found at atra.ncat.org. Don't miss an episode. Subscribe to Voices from the Field wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Rich Myers. ATRA, Voices from the Field, is produced by the National Center for Appropriate Technology, headquartered in Butte, Montana. It's supported by the USDA Rural Business Cooperative Service as part of NCAT's ATRA Sustainable Agriculture Program. Any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this recording are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of the USDA or NCAT. We'll catch you again next week, and until then, keep on farming.